So, to begin with, one should observe that there's no necessary alliance between science and democratic forms of government. Science has flourished under absolute monarchies. It has also, to some extent, one thinks of the Soviet Union, certain disciplines in the Soviet Union, like mathematics, flourished under totalitarian governments. Nonetheless, there is a case to be made that science requires a freedom of inquiry which is best served by democracies. The question is, are democracies best served by science? And here there are two perspectives to keep in mind. One of them is contained in your question, which is insofar as there is a check to the false claims of despots and would-be despots, science has an extremely important role to play. Let me make this very concrete. At the moment in the United States, the Secretary of Health, Robert F. Kennedy, the man who is responsible for the health of American citizens, is attempting to defund any kind of program to promote the vaccination of children. Here is a question where science has an enormous role to play in underscoring the proven benefits of vaccinations, especially for children. But there is another danger to democracy from science, and that is the danger of technocracy. Especially after World War II, there was a great alarm after the atomic bomb explosions at Hiroshima and Nagasaki that the prestige that science had gained through that wartime research would translate into political influence, that there would be a circumventing of the will of the citizens. That danger, the danger that democracy will devolve into technocracy, is very much alive. And it's extremely important that citizens have at least some basic understanding, not obviously of the technical details of the sciences, but how science works. So it's incumbent upon the scientist not only to communicate what they found out, but also how they find it out and what the degrees of uncertainty are in their results. The first fact, perhaps, to keep in mind is that according to recent OECD figures for the nations that belong to the OECD, 94% of scientific research is funded by the public purse. That is, it's funded by citizens. That means two things. First, scientists have an absolute obligation to communicate with the public. These are the people who are making their research possible. And secondly, there is a great temptation to make one's research more certain, more exciting, more relevant, especially practically relevant, than perhaps is strictly justified by the results. So those are two things to keep in mind. First, the obligation of scientists to communicate their science to the public, but also the temptation to exaggerate various aspects of their research and also to announce their results prematurely. And there are lots of cases in the recent news. The second thing to keep in mind is who is actually doing the communication. Scientists have not been trained, for the most part, to communicate with a larger public. That is a great skill that has to be learned. The people who do the communication are science journalists, and science journalists are often extremely skilled at this. On the other hand, they too have some perverse incentives, which unfortunately reinforce the perverse incentives of scientists in a situation where public funding is at stake. And that is to over-dramatize results, to announce results prematurely, and above all, to announce results as more certain than they are. A scientific article will always come with estimations of possible sources of error, possible sources of uncertainty. Moreover, all science is tentative science. There would not be scientific progress if scientific results were not revised and perfected by subsequent science. But this is a message which is often lost in the communication of science, in part because of the deadly intersection of perverse motivations, both on the part of the scientists interested in having their public funding renewed and on the part of the journalists interested in an attention-grabbing headline. We see this, I think, most dramatically in the recent experience with the COVID pandemic. It was a time, and this is absolutely proper, when scientists were in the spotlight because we were all dependent upon their results in order to guide policy as to whether or not we should gather in groups, which groups of people were especially at risk from this particular virus, whether masks worked or not, and under what circumstances. Because the scientists were, first of all, completely unused to communicating the results to a broader public, and moreover, under intense pressure to give some kind of guidance to policymakers, they created the impression that the truths of today were the errors of tomorrow. This is simply the advance of knowledge. There is nothing scandalous about this, but it could be made into a scandal, and it was. Science is as dependent as any other human activity on the judgment and discretion which is required to adjust a general principle or rule to specific circumstances. There have been episodes, however, in the history of science when the scientists have been so afraid of making one kind of error that they have imposed on themselves thin rules. These are the rules of what might be called mechanical objectivity. For example, subjecting the results of an experiment to certain statistical tests. And in certain cases, particularly, for example, in social psychological experiments, which investigate traits which are politically delicate or likely to be controversial, there's a reason for imposing a thin rule, a rule of mechanical objectivity, on the researchers in order to screen any subjective prejudices they may have, of which they may be completely unaware. The history of science, unfortunately, has many episodes, particularly when it's a question of investigating politically controversial cases like race and gender, groups which have been subject to systematic discrimination. There have been cases in which there have been real problems of just the sort that scientists feared when they imposed thin rules of mechanical objectivity on themselves. But for the most part, scientists cannot proceed without thick rules any more than the rest of us can. So, for example, the new wonderful Vera Rubin Observatory, this magnificent camera in the Chilean desert, the researchers are constantly alert to any changes in temperature which might in some way affect the mirror of the telescope and camera. They are constantly alert to the state of the air because choppy air can also interfere with the accuracy of the observations. Like the rest of us, they have to be prepared for circumstances that were not foreseen by the rule. So it would be a great mistake to confuse the authority of science with computer algorithms.